and speak louder. So I'm gonna go through my talk. Basically starts with a bit about why I'm interested in phones, why I think you should be interested in phones, what phones might have to do with activism. Then I'm going to take a deep dive back into the history of phone phreaks and the history of the telephone. Then I'm going to go even further back in history and talk about telephone operators and why we might care about telephone systems and telephone infrastructure prior to what we have now, which are this very heavy emphasis on private lines. And then I'm going to come back out of history to talk about the contemporary moment of how conference calling has helped activists shape their organizing strategies over the last 5 years. And then from there, I'm going to give a little bit of a critique of a few things that I think are sort of accelerating our notion of what might make democracy easier, but not necessarily better in terms of civic engagement, and maybe how we can use the telephone to change that. So I prepared my talk just so that I can stay close to the 30 minutes as well. I get sidetracked very easily, but if you have a clarifying question you want to pose right in the moment, don't hesitate. So without further ado, this is Phreaking Democracy. And so when we talk about phones, we talk a lot about privacy and surveillance. We talk a lot about games like Words with Friends or Candy Crush. We talk about apps and corporations, especially Twitter and Facebook. We talk a lot about the new things phones can do, like connect to the internet, stream video, take pictures, but we rarely talk about phones as phones. And so what is a telephone? It's a system that converts acoustic vibrations into electrical signals in order to transmit sound, typically voices, over a long distance using wire or radio. But what's important is phones are systems. Looking back at the history of telephones helps us understand how the phones link up into other systems like democracy. In this presentation, I'll summarize how I came to understand telephones as a tool for civic engagement and political resistance. So, beginning in 2011, I worked closely with a small group of Occupy protesters who sought to address the lack of reliable communication infrastructure across the movement, and we called ourselves InterOccupy. Because Occupy spread so quickly across the US, there was no good way to connect people in different places. The pace of camp life and repressive tactics of police made communication a secondary issue to many on the ground. And while occupiers would often share information on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, WePay, Livestream, Tumblr, Flickr, websites, text message, video chat, through email, or in meetings, or at marches or demonstrations, there was really no good way to get people in New York in touch with people in LA. For example, in January 2012, there were 10,000 unread email messages in the main inbox for the OccupyWallST.org website, and even more unread messages strewn across the landfill of social media. So communication, though, has always been an integral part of social movements, especially when it comes to coordination. There's history books written about the Spanish Revolution and the co-opting of the telephone exchange, literally the seizure of the telephone exchange in Barcelona. There's writing about Students for a Democratic Society and their use of long-distance telephone lines. There's lots of writing about May '68 and their graffiti and pamphlet scene. And even with the civil rights movement, a lot of people tell me, well, Occupy didn't really change anything, it didn't really do anything with technology, and if you look back to the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King didn't even have a computer. And I often respond with this image, but he had a telephone, and he used it quite a bit. So contemporary network social movements rely heavily on the internet to elicit participation. However, rarely do movements take up the tasks of supporting the internal life of the movement so that a community can form in the initial wave of after the initial wave of protest. As a result, movements have a difficult time sustaining participation if they don't turn to supporting communication directly. That is to say, without communication infrastructure, network movements fail to produce subsequent waves of protest. Tonight I'll show you how phones became integral to the Occupy movement and how the history of telephones and activism can help us produce distributed direct action in the future. So this is funny. Some people, older people, think of, what's your number? Younger people will be like, well, what's your hashtag, right? It's mind-boggling, but it's true. The older you get, the more that doesn't look like what young people think it is. So when we think of technology as used by contemporary movements, we often turn to thinking about Twitter. The digitization of text has made an enormous impact on all spheres of culture and society. Snowden's a prime example of how digitized text-based communication allowed for the extraction of thousands of documents from the NSA, or the National Security Administration. Pictured here is his very first tweet where he asks, "Can you hear me now?" which is a familiar refrain if you know the history of telephones, from Watson to AT&T to even Verizon and Sprint ads. But what's important about this is that Twitter is actually a telephone network. In terms of format, the use of the pound symbol by a dev at Twitter was a clever way of getting the user to code their messages so that a search engine could quickly find and return a specific text string. Twitter designers wanted their search function to work on clunky SMS phones where there were only two symbols available to them on the keypad, either the star symbol or the hashtag, or what we used to call the pound sign. So we could just as easily be typing star Occupy Wall Street, but not much else. Nonetheless, it was this hack on the hash function of phones that has transformed social movement organizing and naming. And so I want to also say that movements don't solely rely on the internet. Especially for internal coordination, Occupy activists moved to direct communication in less public spaces, especially conference calls. And so I was part of a group of people at part of a national network of activists that formed what we called interoccupy.net. It began as an effort to directly connect the hundreds of camps across the movement, and using a combination of conference calls, email lists, newsletters, social media, we acted as a filter that verified information as well as a space of deliberation for national coordination. And I'll return to this later, but let's talk about another group of people who are famous for using the telephone. So this is the second part of the talk. We're going to get into talking about phreaker history. So Marshall McLuhan, a theorist of society and culture and communication, remarked that the phone is an irresistible intruder in time and space. In the 1950s, phone phreakers would explore the telephone system by dialing around and listening to the clicks and beeps. Like cyberspace, telephones were connected and held the capacity to coordinate social action, but people really needed to understand how to use them in order to unlock the connective functions. In an article published in the Belt System Technical Journal in 1960, titled, and it's pictured here, "Signaling Systems for Control of Telephone Switching," changed the way that phone phreaks methodologically approached understanding the telephone system. Previous to this document, some would call Bell and pretend to be another operator with a technical question about the system, and phreaks would do this trial and error in an effort to cobble together enough information about how the system worked. And this, in the late 50s, early 60s, is considered the birth of a hacking technique we now call social engineering, where you use the bits of information you have to impersonate or trick someone into giving you the information that you want. While this technique continues and is now also known as a phishing scam, phreaks emphasized understanding the infrastructure of the telephone system so that they could hack it. In order to phreak phones, either perfect pitch or techno fix was needed. Each number dialed emitted a tone you could train yourself to hear, and you could also identify the codes used by the telephone company if you could hear the pitch. You know, basically, if you had perfect hearing, you could identify those tones that were using that the telephone keypad would emit. Especially if you called an operator and heard them patch you through to another line, if you could identify the tones, you could actually direct dial the phone either by mimicry or by playing tones on a whistle, keyboard, or cassette. One of the most notable phone phreaks, pictured here, Joy Bubbles, was a blind man with perfect pitch who could hum the tones. Some even trained canaries to sing the famous 2600 hertz. And John Draper, who we've got a disciple here of Captain Crunch, he used a whistle. He's famous for using a whistle pictured here from a cereal box to place free calls. So In the 1970s, less gifted phone phreakers, you like how I do that? I call the Apple guy the less gifted phone phreaker, right? Learned how to mimic these tones using blue boxes to make free calls. The boxes were packed full of resistors, capacitors, and inductors, but they were also very sensitive to temperature. So phreakers began sharing information about how to build better boxes via newsletters and through computer and radio hobbyist circles. At this time, making free calls was illegal, as was possessing a blue box, but of course the police had to know what it was if they were going to arrest you for it. And pictured here is the blue box, Steve Wozniak's blue box that's at the Computer History Museum. And he and Steve Jobs used to build and sell blue boxes in order to buy other computer parts. And there's an interesting story about them phone phreaking the Vatican, so they place a free call to the Vatican. But most of the information that one needed to do phone phreaking was already available in university libraries, like the ones at Stanford that the Steves used to build their first blue box. So they got the Bell System Technical Journal in order to build this technology that would allow them to place these free calls. So this is a picture of the first page of the Teltronics Company of America newsletter. As this practice of building boxes gained notoriety in the 70s, phone companies sought out those who were sharing information about not just boxes, but also telephone communications itself. The Teltronics newsletter for phreakers sparked outrage from the Pacific Telephone and Telegraph Company in 1974 when it published schematics of how to connect up to 4 phones into the same conference. This is a picture of the Teltronics Company of America newsletter showing you how to make your own conference line. The phone company, the Pacific Telephone and Telegraph Company, responded by getting a court order to prevent the newsletter from circulating to its subscribers, a prelude to the relationship that we would have with culture industries and home innovation. You can think about this being a prelude to the way we think about home taping, or even the case of Metallica versus Napster. What these companies feared is that ordinary people would figure out how to use their hardware to do things that the corporations could not profit from. And less is known about telephone companies who work to squash communication enthusiasts, and we can talk about in the discussion why we don't know as much about the history of phone phreaking as we should. But this points to a major knowledge deficit between students who had access to institutionalized education and technical manuals like the Steves, and hobbyists who were tinkering with hardware and software at home or with payphones. This knowledge deficit meant that hobbyists were continuously trying to reverse engineer existing telephone systems while innovating on the margins of their utility. Most importantly, phone phreaks were invested not in just making the infrastructure of the telephone company visible, but also in forming a community around it. Other methods for information sharing also took hold within this emerging community of phreaks, especially through conference calling. While the telephone system in the 70s had evolved into a sophisticated international system, it was a broken teletype exchange that was the preferred platform of phreaks. Prior to faxes and email, teletype machines were built to transfer printed words over telephone lines. While dialing Vancouver's area code, phreaks discovered an open teletype line that allowed for direct dialing. Moreover, it could support many callers simultaneously. So the 211 conference, as they called it, was a major turning point in the formation of a community of phreakers because it solidified the distributed network in a way that reflected their desire for free and open lines of communication. The conference ended months later when a change in hardware no longer supported the malfunction that the phreaks had turned into a feature. And as Jason Scott, who some of you may know, he runs the Text Files website as well as part of the Internet Archive, he describes some of these phreaker conference calls that he was on. And he would say the difference between a two-party call and a telephone conference was like the difference between a snow cone and skiing. And the best part was how sometimes the conference would come to you. unannounced, just you picking up the ringing phone and a dozen people would call out your name, Jason, and drag you into a never-ending conversation. And if you know Jason, that's possible. It's got a lot of stories, all very interesting ones. So conference calls became a staple early on in these groups who were experimenting in this distributed computer system that was spreading across the United States. And here's a screenshot of the Phreaker archives on the Text Files website. By the mid-1980s, information about phreaking was available on bulletin board systems where the codes needed to make free calls and schematics for modifying equipment were widely shared. Significantly, some of this information was found in dumpster diving expeditions at the office of the phone company, and sometimes also involved searching the garbage of telephone workers themselves. The information on phreaking was never complete, but always patched together from what was available. Phreakers innovated with and became more sophisticated as a result of the phone company's attempts to control communication and make it into a commodity. The phone company didn't care who you would call as long as they could charge you for doing it. Phreakers sought to open the lines by understanding the technical specificity of the infrastructure and subverting it for both knowledge and fun. Later, phreaking would become so politicized that phreakers like Kevin Mitnick would spend years in jail without a trial because it was rumored that he could launch nuclear missiles with a phone connection. Although Kevin may be partly to blame for his own mythic stature here. So conference calls in the 1970s about phreaking were exciting, but conference calling was not really new. The first phone lines were communal party lines. That is, people were linked together in community on the same phone lines prior to everyone having a private line. If one person was on the phone in your area, you could hear the conversations and even join in. But if too many people listened, then the signal would degrade quickly and the phone would hang up. This was due to the way that phones were powered, usually by crank. And here are a couple of articles, one from 1959 about listening in on the party line, and then this one is about pirates over there. The party line system was good at connecting communities to one another in times of crisis, as people could relay calls if they needed a doctor, and it was also very good for spreading gossip. In terms of the pirates, pirates were people who reported to the telephone operator that basically the wrong name for billing. The operator would say, "Who should we bill this call to?" And they'd say, "Andrew, of course." As well, women's subscribers were vilified for having a lack of proper phone etiquette and being quote-unquote phone hogs. This lack of tact was usually blamed on the fact that most people on the line remained anonymous. Despite this reputation, women were the moving parts that made the network flow. Most of the literature and archival materials on phreaks portray them as gifted, if not misguided, men. Yet there is some archival evidence for women's involvement in phreaking, though, especially if you look at some of the reflections on phreaking. I found one from the 70s. So this phreaker writes, "Just before the free conference call shut down for lack of funds, we had our first contact with an actual phone phreak, an American woman by the name of Solitaire. She started cutting in from time to time. She told us that one of the loop lines was unsouped, which meant that people could call from anywhere in North America without getting billed," end quote. While we may not have the same depth of history about women in phreaking, the extent of their presence extended across the telephone network because their bodies were integral to the circuits. Contrary to the image of female subscribers, the switchboard operators were women who were selected based on particular criteria, and this is from an AT&T recruiting ad. They state, "Applicants should be unmarried between the ages of 17 and 26. She has to look prim and proper and have arms long enough to reach the top of the tall telephone switchboard," end quote. No women of color were allowed to be operators. By the 1900s, nearly all operators were women, but this is because Bell would only hire women for the job. Initially, teenage boys were the first operators, but they were known to misbehave. There's something about mischief in the telephone and anonymity that's something that I think we ascribe to values or the ways in which people use the internet, but we can see this through this telecom's history. Operators had access to all calls going through the system and often had to listen to know when to hang up. Eventually, people began asking operators questions about the news, sports scores, the weather, and community events. Their tasks slowly expanded to include being a source of verified and reliable information long before you could dial 411. And so for some of you here, you used to be able to dial 411 and say, you know, when's this movie playing? You could ask a whole range of questions, and the operator would give you the answer. So these operators, working 10 to 16 hours a day for substandard wages, were often subject to surveillance by management and harsh punishment for making mistakes. And rural operators sometimes had a board installed in their own home. And in this photo in particular, the female operators are showing how new computerized core boards, or switchboards, were taking over the control from operators. And it's this adoption of an automatic switching system that actually allowed for the blue boxes to proliferate. So fast forward into 1983, the last party line was shut off, and with home phones, most people had their own private number. By the 1900s, phreaking became more difficult as telephone companies developed systems to surveil users and detect phreakers. Importantly, throughout their entire history, phreaks viewed the phones as, quote, one large computer system, and that this computer system could be radically altered once the infrastructure was known. As Captain Crunch told Esquire magazine in 1971, he said, quote, "I'm learning about a system. The phone company is a system. A computer is a system. Do you understand? If I do what I do, it's only to explore a system. Computers, systems. That's my bag. The phone company is nothing but a computer." Phone phreakers like Crunch were explicit that their practice was apolitical. But others like the Yippies, the Youth International Party Line, used phreaking as a political means to disrupt the system. In their first issue, which pictured here, they wrote, quote, "The disappointment we feel towards America," note the K there, "has turned to hatred as we saw the futility of the movement to improve it. The Yippies believe that education alone cannot affect the system, but education can be an invaluable tool for those willing to use it. Specifically, Yippies will show you why something must be done immediately in regard, of course, to the improper control of the communication in this country by none other than the Bell Telephone Company." And we can still hear the Yippies in the background as we wage another battle for net neutrality and broadband privacy. From party lines to those early phreaker telephone conferences, the history of teleconferences is a story of anonymity, subversion, and coordination. Conference calls became very popular with global businesses in the 1980s as the telephone systems developed. That is, more power meant you could circulate more people. In the same way that the phreakers explored telephone infrastructure, computer hackers eventually went on to explore not just the contours of cyberspace, but the communities that jack in. So what does this all have to do with social movements or civic engagement? In my activism, I focus on the capacity to coordinate and align activists in time and space using many platforms, but especially conference calls. While the internet allows users in communications to be displaced in both space and time, using voice-to-voice communication centers the community in different ways and offers other possibilities for organizing. Those who joined up with InterOccupy have the ethics of the phreakers, but their work looks a lot more like the early telephone operators. Long hours, waiting for people to get off the phone, waiting for people to get on the phone. What I found in my research on the people creating the infrastructure of the Occupy movement, it's that most of the information work falls on women for various reasons. Some stated not feeling welcome to speak in camps or in large meetings. They say sometimes that men are too damn loud, or that they feel uncomfortable in large assemblies. However, as this history of telephones show, women performing technical and invisible labor is really nothing new. Those who joined the InterOccupy project saw a logistical problem early on. While social media was good for shouting, it was not good for talking. Email too failed to help coordinate the movement because things were moving too fast. And I'll just give you another anecdote. From October 2011 to January 2012, during the peak of Occupy, I was receiving upwards of 100 emails a day unsolicited. So a different fix was necessary to transition the weak ties to stronger ones. That is, from getting people you might follow on Twitter to people you will speak to on the phone. Interoccupy began using web conferencing system, micro conference call, pictured here. Micro is a hybrid technology born out of the technological synthesis of radio, phone, and the internet. And the technology focuses on coordination and connectivity over speed. Here we can put 500 people on the same phone call and then split them into small groups, which is no small task. And one of the things that the movement's always hated about relying on Maestro is that it's not open source, and we don't actually own the technology, and we can't distribute it as widely as we would like. But in any case, Interoccupy also began phreaking the Maestro system to explore its capabilities and understand its limits. While the internet extends communication across countries, voice communication is still difficult for a variety of reasons, including language barriers, time zone differences, but also that the cost of making calls can still be pretty high for people in other countries. Because Maestro uses phone lines, long distance was a unique challenge which was solved by daisy chaining lines together over Skype and Google Hangout into one conference call line. That means that there can be sometimes up to 12 people sharing the same phone line into a call with hundreds of others. Like the old lines, the sound quality degrades rapidly, and many of these participants are relegated to listening in. Since October 2011, Interoccupy has hosted over 2,000 conference calls. I actually just stopped counting at 2,000. And Interoccupy has infrastructurally supported the efforts of several social movement organizations that took on the long-term industrial labor.
Another phone freaker.
I know, she's just like, she's practicing 2,600, and I am loving every video. Like, someone get this on tape so we can see what we can get with it. Yeah. So, in terms of supporting other social movement organizations, Interoccupy has helped with various events. Some of you may have heard of, such as the West Coast port shutdown, the May Day general strike of 2012, the group Strike Debt, the group The Debt Collective, Million Hoodies for Trayvon Martin, No NATO protests, the People for Bernie Sanders, Showing Up for Racial Justice, Black Lives Matter, as well as the Occupy Sandy disaster relief effort. Interestingly, while Interoccupy has always envisioned ourselves as a network that circulated ideas, it didn't occur to any of us that we could also distribute goods. This fact, though, was obvious when the movement had camps, as occupiers were able to feed, clothe, and provide medical services to many on a daily basis. But after the raids, the question remained, how could Occupy enliven a spirit of public service akin to the one felt in the camps? And I think the example of Occupy Sandy shows that whatever networks move information can also move goods and people. Interoccupy with other groups used the infrastructure built after the encampments to mobilize over 50,000 volunteers and raise $2.5 million in resources. So that's no small feat. In practice, the call to Occupy Sandy required Interoccupy and others to tap every pre-existing network, utilize every communication technology, and contribute every skill to organize this large-scale mutual aid project. And of course, the conditions of the crisis still matter. Part of the issue of mobilizing people right now is, how do you get people to care about something that they might not see as damaging as a storm, right? It's very obvious that when 40,000 people are made homeless, but how do you convince them that the rollback on their broadband privacy is as important as 40,000 people going homeless? And so looking at Interoccupy as part of the history of telecommunication infrastructure reveals the importance of selecting the right tool for the job. And so this is the kind of concluding few slides here. I ask the question a lot, what can a telephone do? And so mobile communications such as smartphones and laptops with Wi-Fi are technologies of social change that allow users to connect to the global network from anywhere with signal. And we must begin to think about them as tools for phreaking democracy. Global movements against capitalism have creatively reimagined the uses and constraints of social media's capacity to network and broadcast. And we must understand the infrastructure of these technologies if we are to use them to build a sense of togetherness to combat the system. Control of our communication system, which includes hardware and software, is paramount. And we must think about this in terms of digital divides. where unequal access and unequal openness produce inequalities across technological and political systems. So Elizabeth Warren recently was on Rachel Maddow saying that the calls to Congress have an important effect that emails and letters do not. So many people have been calling into Congress that everyone was reporting getting a busy signal, and people wanted a more efficient process for leaving a message. So Stance is an app that was built by developers where you can leave a message that they will then keep trying your congressperson until they can leave that message on your congressperson's voicemail box. And so they improve efficiency, but I want to caution us to think that automation is the answer. I don't think it's the answer. When groups like Move On automated the petition, it became a useless political tool. Sending tweets or Facebook messages to Congress is even less meaningful than graffiti. Do you hear what I'm saying? If you want them to notice, spray paint the walls. Right? I'm saying that very clearly because I'm saying tweeting at them is not the same thing, right? It's still words, but the method matters. The medium matters. While congressional staffers are most swayed by op-eds in local papers, hint, write some op-eds, as well as personalized letters where you tell your harrowing tale of why your broadband privacy matters to you. The phone is useful insofar as it takes up time and offers opportunities for questioning. If there's anything I've learned from movements, it's that achieving a democratic ideal is slow and requires deliberation. Attempts to automate democracy and rid it of its bureaucratic unpleasantness also strips the citizen of the power of engagement. So what would Phreaking Democracy actually look like? So modern-day phone phreaker Brad Carter uses social engineering in order to produce his prank call podcast called The Snowplow Show. And if you know me, you know I am a big fan. Brad is also employed as a private detective who specializes in obtaining difficult-to-find information online. He's well known in hacker circles both for his knowledge of phreaking and almost obsessive desire not to let the subculture die. One technique he and others employ is called phone mobbing. It's the act of organizing groups of people to call a specific number or group of numbers all at once, such as banks of payphones, so you can tell how this definition is a little dated, because we don't have banks of payphones anymore, radio call-in shows, and other conference calls. On his podcast, they've infiltrated corporations' conference calls, like Radio Shack and Blockbuster. They've mobbed radio call-in shows like Loveline, as well as AM radio stations. And they've used conferences to pretend to be businesses calling customers. And Brad Carter and his show is the fun type of phone phreaker, right? He's really interested in understanding systems, but he's also wants to have some fun. And so when he impersonates managers of a business, maybe he tries to get the employees to do this thing they call flip all the switches, right? To go in the back and flip all the shit, to shut the lights off. And then it's funny as the caller because usually they're on a wireless phone and they hit a switch and it shuts the phone off and it's the end of the prank. It's very fun. I promise. So I asked myself, thinking with this technique, this tactic, what could a phone mob do? And it's funny that this happened because I'd been thinking about it when I was asked to do the talk, but this week we actually witnessed a phone mob of President Trump's voice line that was enabled by Twitter users. Here people call into the voice line, where voice stands for Victims of Immigration Crime and a Crime Engagement Office, and when calling, a government agent would pick up the line and take the report, and the caller would describe being victimized by space aliens. Because every single call to the government is logged and recorded, they do not have to take you seriously, but they do have to listen, and they shouldn't hang up. And this type of phone mob can tie up resources and jam lines for hours. And phone mobbing is a form of protest akin to what we might remember as the Black Fax or a contemporary model of the DDoS. As well, there's a new opportunity for Phreaking Democracy that I'd like to raise your attention to. There are these new ways in which Republican Congress people are trying to get you engaged by doing these telephone town halls. They've done these telephone town halls in the past, but the Utah Republican Party, as well as other Republicans, are starting to use them more and more. And they advise this because There have been physical mobs at town halls. So they write, this organized mob has displayed hostile, violent, and deliberately disruptive behavior, which is unfair to constituents as it hijacks town hall meetings to prevent any type of meaningful discussion. Because of this clear demonstration of violence, if congressional members feel they cannot provide adequate security, they should consider tele-town halls to reach out to their constituents instead. And I should tell you that these tele-town halls can hold up to 10,000 people, right? So it's very much more like radio than it is like a conference call. And I think to myself, what would it look like, or perhaps what would it sound like if they opened a line to a caller and then heard hundreds of people chanting together, "Show me what democracy looks like." And this can be done, and it's not even that hard. We all just need to be waiting on a separate conference call line. And so as politicians shift to the conference call, so should we. And we should open them up as party lines. We should think about them as party lines. And so lastly, I conclude by saying, I believe that we will win. And civic engagement to me means no shortcuts. It means that we shouldn't rely on technology to make democracy easier. We should rely on it as a tool for political resistance in the streets, in the workplace, and at home. And if we really want to let freedom ring, we should start by phreaking the system together. Thank you.